In a city of mirrors and chrome, the shadows have a way of telling the truth that everyone else tries to hide. Experience the high contrast reality of our latest cinematic series, where every reflection reveals a different side of the story. Subscribe today and see through the illusions with us. The call came at 20 past 2 in the morning. I know the exact time because I'd been lying awake anyway, the way I always do in the first week of November. 38 years of November, and I still can't sleep through the 4th. That's the day they pulled my brother's body from the Fraser River. That's the day our family stopped being whole. So when the phone rang, I was already sitting up in the dark, looking at the ceiling of my bedroom in Abbotsford, listening to the rain come down the way. Only a BC November can steady and indifferent and cold. I almost didn't answer. The number was a 250 area code, which is interior BC, and I didn't recognize it. I figured it was a wrong number, maybe a drunk dial, but something made me pick up. I still can't explain what. "Is this Robert?" the voice said. It was a man's voice, older, a little rough, like someone who hadn't used it much that day. There was noise in the background, a TV, maybe, or a radio. "Yes," I said. "Who's calling?" There was a pause, not a long one, but the kind that feels like the person on the other end is gathering something. Courage, maybe, or the right words. "Robert," he said again. "It's your brother. It's Colin." I didn't say anything. I want to tell you that in that moment, I felt something profound, some deep cellular recognition, some shift in the world. But the honest truth is that my first feeling was anger. Cold, immediate anger. Because my brother Colin has been dead since 1986. Because I stood at his graveside in Mission, BC, when I was 24 years old. Because whoever was on that phone was either deeply disturbed or deeply cruel, and I wasn't sure which was worse. "I don't know who you are," I said, "but this isn't funny. Don't call this number again." I hung up. I sat there in the dark for a long time after that. My wife, Marie, stirred beside me and asked if everything was all right. I told her it was nothing, a wrong number. She went back to sleep. But I didn't sleep at all that night, because the voice on the phone had said something else before I hung up. Something I almost missed. Something so small and specific that it had no business being in the mouth of a stranger. He'd said, "Robert," the way Dad used to say it when he was proud of you. That was a thing our father did, a specific thing. He had a particular way of saying your name when he was pleased with you, slower, softer, like he was tasting it. I'd never told anyone about that. Marie didn't know it. My own kids had never heard me describe it. It wasn't something you could guess. I didn't call the number back that night, but I wrote it down. Let me tell you about my brother Colin before I go any further, because you need to understand who he was and what losing him meant. Colin was 4 years younger than me, born in 1966 in Chilliwack, the second of 3 boys. Our parents, Gerald and Edna McPherson, raised us in a small house on the edge of town near the fairgrounds. Dad worked at the mill. Mum did books for a couple of local businesses out of the kitchen. It was a quiet life, a good life, the kind you don't fully appreciate until it's gone. Colin was the one everyone remembered, not because he was the loudest that was our youngest brother, Dennis, but because he had this quality of paying attention that made you feel like you were the only person. He listened to you like what you were saying mattered. He was like that with everybody. Teachers, neighbors, the old men at the rink, kids at school. People just naturally moved toward Colin. He was 20 years old in the autumn of 1986. He'd finished his first year at BCIT in Burnaby studying electrical, and he'd taken a summer job up near Kamloops on a work crew doing infrastructure work. He was saving money to go back for his second year. He wrote to Mum every 2 weeks. Actual letters. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. He was coming home for Thanksgiving. The bus left Kamloops on the afternoon of October 9th, 1986. It was a Greyhound coach, a regular run, Kamloops to Vancouver via the Coquihalla. There were about 30 passengers, the driver, and a relief driver. It was raining. It had been raining for 3 days. You may remember the Coquihalla. In those years, the highway had only opened that spring, and the infrastructure was new, and that particular stretch through the mountains was already developing a reputation. The combination of rain, darkness, a steep grade, and a pullout that wasn't properly marked led to the driver making a correction that took the bus off the shoulder on the far side of a curve. The coach went down an embankment, rolled twice. 3 people died at the scene. 7 more were seriously injured. Colin's name was on the passenger manifest. Our father identified a body matching Colin's description at the Merritt Hospital. Dark hair. My brother's height, 5'10". A jacket that looked like the one Colin wore. A wallet nearby with no ID. The thinking was it had scattered in the roll, but with $35 in cash. Dad identified him. He was 61 years old, and he had to look at his son lying on a hospital table. And he said, "Yes, that's Colin." And he drove home and didn't speak for 2 days. We buried him on October 18th, 1986. Mum died 4 years later. The doctors called it heart failure, but our family always knew differently. Dennis moved to Ontario in the 90s, and we've kept in touch but never spoken easily. Dad lived until 2009, quiet and steady until the end, but there was always something behind his eyes in October that I couldn't reach. I've had 38 Novembers since then, some harder than others, and then the phone rang. I waited 2 days before I called the number back. I'm not proud of that. I told myself I was being cautious, that I wasn't going to let some stranger play games with my grief. But the truth is I was scared. Not scared that it was a con, scared that it might not be. He answered on the second ring. "I wasn't sure you'd call back," he said. "Tell me something," I said. "Tell me something only my brother would know." There was that pause again. Then, "The summer you were 16, you and Danny Kowalski from down the road took Dad's truck without asking and got it stuck in the ditch out on Lickman Road. You told Dad a story about helping a neighbor, and he pretended to believe you. But that winter, when I was maybe 9 or 10, Dad told me the whole story and laughed about it. He said you were the worst liar in the family. He said the mud on the wheel wells gave you away in about 5 minutes. I sat down on the edge of the kitchen counter. No one knew that story. Danny Kowalski moved to Calgary in 1979, and I hadn't spoken to him in over 20 years. My father never told that story to anyone that I knew of, not to Marie, not to my kids, not at Christmas, or around any table I'd ever sat at. "Who are you?" I said. My voice came out strange, flat. "I don't know all of it," he said. "That's what I've been trying to tell you. I don't have everything. I have pieces. I have the truck story. I have the smell of Mum's kitchen at Christmas. I have the layout of the house, the back porch where the light never worked right, the crack in the bathroom ceiling. I have your face at about 14, 15. I have Dad's voice, but I've been missing most of it for a very long time." "Where are you?" "Penticton," he said. "I've been here for the last 12 years. Before that, I was in the Kootenays. Before that, it gets complicated." I asked him what happened. I asked him how he survived the crash and ended up in Penticton 38 years later. He said he'd try to explain, but that he needed to say something first. "I know how this sounds," he said. "I know. I'm not asking you to believe me on the phone. I'm just asking you to come and see me. That's all. You can decide for yourself." I talked it over with Marie that night. She listened to everything, the phone call, the truck story, the details about the house, and she didn't say it was impossible, which I think I needed. She said it was worth finding out. "What's the worst that can happen?" she said. "The worst is, I drive 4 hours and meet a stranger who's been researching our family for some reason I can't understand yet. And the best?" I didn't answer that. I wasn't ready to say it out loud. I drove to Penticton on a Saturday. It was one of those cold November days that turns the Okanagan, the color of old brass, the vines stripped, the hills brown and gray, the lake flat and pewter. I'd been to Penticton plenty of times in my life, but it felt different that day. Smaller, more fragile. He'd given me an address on a residential street a few blocks from the south end of town. A small house, older, well-maintained. A truck in the driveway, wood stacked along the side of the house, under a tarp. I sat in my car for a few minutes before I went to the door. The man who answered was in his late 50s. Lean, maybe 5, 9, or 10, with gray hair cut short and a face that had spent a lot of time outdoors. He was wearing a work shirt and jeans. He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as careful, like he was watching for something, reading me. And then I felt it. I don't know how else to explain it except to say that something very old in me recognized something very old in him. Not completely, not cleanly, but there was a shape to his face, something around the eyes and the line of the jaw that made the floor tilt under me. "Come in," he said. I made coffee. We sat at his kitchen table for 3 hours. His name for the last 37 years has been Gary Nielsen. That's the name on his driver's license, his sin, his whole adult life. He'd been working as an electrician, which stopped me cold when he said it. I stared at him, and he nodded slowly. "I know," he said. He told me what he remembered of the accident, which wasn't much. A sound, motion, cold, then nothing for a long time. What the doctors later pieced together, much later, years later, when he was finally in a position to try to understand it, was that he had been thrown clear of the bus when it rolled. He came to rest in brush at the bottom of the embankment, partially sheltered, not visible from the road. By the time search crews were accounting for passengers in the rain and the dark, the manifest had its 3 confirmed dead, and the rest were accounted for either treated on scene, transported, or identified as passengers who had disembarked at an earlier stop. No one looked for a 20-year-old man in the brush, 30 meters down the slope. He was found the next morning by a man named Walter Nielsen, a farmer from just outside of Merritt, who was driving past and saw something in the drainage below the shoulder. Walter stopped. He climbed down. He found a young man, badly injured, unconscious, with no identification. Walter Nielsen had lost his own son 2 years earlier in a farming accident. He was 64 years old, widowed, and living alone. He loaded the young man into his truck and drove him not to the hospital in Merritt, where the bus accident victims were being processed, but to a clinic in Quilchena, a small community even further east, where a semi-retired doctor named Aldous Frey patched him up over 3 days. Why didn't Walter take him to Merritt? This is the question I've turned over 100 times since. The answer, as best I can understand it, is that Walter was a man of an older generation, deeply private, and he'd already decided something in those minutes on the embankment. He'd told himself a story. He'd looked at this young man with dark hair and good hands and decided that God had given him something back. He named him Gary. Gary Walter Nielsen. It wasn't legal. It wasn't right. But Walter was isolated, and the doctor was old and discreet, and had perhaps made a different kind of judgment, and the young man with no memory, when he came back to consciousness, had no way to contradict anything. The brain injury was significant. Not the kind that takes everything, not the profound amnesia of the movies, but the kind that selectively disrupts. He lost most of his personal history. The names were gone, or scrambled. The places, the relationships. What remained were fragments and feelings, a voice that might have been a father's, the smell of something cooking, a face at a certain age, a truck stuck in the mud on a country road. Walter Nielsen died in 1993. By then, Gary had been Gary for 7 years. He'd rebuilt a life in the way you build things when you're working from a damaged foundation carefully, one piece at a time. He'd apprenticed in electrical. He'd moved around. He'd been married briefly, in the late 90s, no children. He'd lived his life. The memories had come back slowly, in the way that concussion sometimes lets things return, not in order, not reliably, often at strange hours. A name would surface, a detail. He'd write them down, not knowing what to do with them. "How long have you known?" I asked. "Known for certain?" "About 2 years," he said. "I hired a researcher. I gave her the fragments, the name Robert, the town, the mill, a father called Gerald. She found the McPhersons of Chilliwack inside of a month." "And you waited 2 years to call?" He looked at his coffee cup. "I wasn't sure you'd want to know. I drove home that afternoon, and I pulled over twice on the highway. Not because of the roads, because of my eyes." He had agreed to a DNA test. Not reluctantly immediately. He'd been waiting, he said, for someone to ask. "I contacted a service in Kelowna that a friend recommended, one that does kinship testing, and we both gave samples on the same day the following week. The results would take 10 to 14 business days. I did not tell Dennis yet. Dennis is 70 years old and lives outside of Guelph with his wife and his grandchildren, and the thought of raising this with him and then having it turn out to be wrong, I couldn't do it. I told Marie, and Marie alone. Those 2 weeks were the strangest of my life. I'd find myself doing ordinary things, making breakfast, putting gas in the car, watching the news, and suddenly the weight of what was pending would drop onto me, and I'd have to stop and just breathe. Because here is what was also true. Underneath the hope and the disbelief, There was a grave in Mission, BC, with my brother's name on it. Colin James McPherson, 1966, 1986, beloved son and brother. My father had kneeled at that grave. My mother had put flowers on it every year until she couldn't anymore. I'd been there dozens of times. I'd stood there alone on a Sunday morning in November and talked to the stone like that made any sense. Someone was in that grave. Someone's son. Someone's brother. On the 14th day, at 4:37 inches the afternoon, I got a call from the service in Kelowna. The result was a match. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the grocery store where I'd been when the call came in, and I didn't move for a very long time. I watched people come and go with their carts, loading bags into their trunks, going on with their afternoons. Somewhere in Penticton, a man named Gary Nielsen was waiting. I called him. "I know," he said, when I told him the result. His voice was quiet. "Yeah," I said. Neither of us spoke for a moment. "I'm sorry it took so long," he said. "You're here now," I said. And then, because it was the truest thing I knew how to say, "Colin." There was a long silence, and then I heard something on the other end of the line that I recognized from a very long time ago, a sound he used to make when he was trying not to cry, a kind of held breath, a thing I hadn't heard in 38 years. "Yeah," he said finally. "I'm here." Dennis flew out from Ontario 3 weeks later. I didn't try to prepare him for it over the phone, some things you can't prepare for. I just asked him to come, and told him it was important, and that I would explain when he arrived. He came. The three of us sat in my living room in Abbotsford, and Marie made tea, and then found somewhere else to be, because she understands people, and she knew this was ours. I watched my youngest brother look at my other brother across a coffee table for the first time in 38 years. Dennis is a big man, always has been, broad across the shoulders, the kind of man who fills a room. I watched him look at Colin, at Gary, at this lean, quiet man with gray hair and careful eyes, and I watched Dennis's face do something I'd never seen it do. It just opened. He didn't say anything for almost a minute. Then he said, "You still hold your coffee cup the same way." Colin looked down at his hand. He was holding the mug with his thumb through the handle and his index finger across the top. He looked back at Dennis. "Mum used to tell me not to hold it like that," he said. "She said I'd burn myself." Dennis covered his face with both hands. Later, after a lot of coffee and a lot of talking and a point somewhere in the middle where all three of us just sat in silence for a while, Dennis asked the question that I knew was coming. "Who's in the grave?" "We've been trying to find out. Here is what we know. On the night of October 9th, 1986, when Walter Nielsen took my brother to Quilchena rather than Merritt, the official response was working from a passenger manifest that it believed was complete. Our father identified a body, a young man of similar appearance, similar height, similar coloring, in conditions that were chaotic and upsetting, and not designed for precision. The wallet with $35 was near enough to the body to seem connected. Grief, as anyone who's been through it knows, has a way of making you see what you expect to see. The man my father identified was someone. He had a family somewhere. He had a mother, possibly, or brothers, or someone who noticed he was gone. We've contacted the RCMP. I won't pretend it was a simple conversation explaining what happened, who we are, what we're asking, but they have been serious about it, and the case has been opened for review. There is now a formal process to identify the individual in my brother's grave through DNA, with the goal of matching any result against missing persons records from that period. It is a slow process, these things are. The records from 1986 are not always digital, not always complete. But they exist, and people are looking. What I want to say to any family out there who lost someone in that fall of 1986, someone who was on a coach from Kamloops, or someone who disappeared in that part of BC in that season is this. Please reach out. Please give your DNA. Please let the people working on this know that your loved one existed and deserves to come home. Because here is what I believe. After everything, the man in that grave was someone's Colin. He was someone's brother who wrote letters home and was careful with his money and made people feel listened to. He had a name. He had a family who didn't know what happened to him. He deserves better than the name McPherson. He deserves his own. Colin, I'm going to keep calling him Colin because that's who he is, even if the paperwork still says Gary Nielsen, and even if that's going to take a long time to untangle legally, has been to Abbotsford 4 times since November. He spent Christmas with us, which was the strangest and most full Christmas I can remember since my children were small. Marie made her mother's shortbread, the kind she always makes, and at some point I looked across the kitchen and saw Colin leaning against the counter, eating a piece of it with an expression on his face. I couldn't quite read. "You okay?" I asked. "Mum used to make something like this," he said. "I didn't know that was a memory. I thought I'd just always liked shortbread." He met my kids, they're adults now, in their 30s, and he met Dennis's daughter, Janet, who drove up from Portland specifically because she said she wasn't missing this for anything. He walked around the old neighborhood in Chilliwack with me on a cold January afternoon, and I watched him stop in front of a house that isn't our parents' house anymore, hasn't been for decades, and stand there for a long time without speaking. "The back porch," he said finally. "There was a light out there that buzzed." "Dad never fixed it," I said. "He kept saying he would." "He kept saying he would," I agreed. We stood there in front of someone else's house in the cold, and neither of us said anything for a while, and that was all right. There is a grave in Mission, BC, that still says Colin James McPherson. Until we know whose it really is, we've decided to leave it. It doesn't feel right to remove a name before we can replace it with the right one. So for now, we visit, and we bring flowers, and we hold 2 things at once: the grief we carried for 38 years, and the strange, fragile, completely unexpected gift of what came after. Dennis asked me a few weeks ago if I was angry. Angry at Walter Nielsen, who made a selfish choice out of grief and loneliness. Angry at old Dr. Frey, who looked the other way. Angry at the systems that failed to find a missing person. I thought about it honestly. "I think I was," I said. "For a while. And now?" "Now I just keep thinking about Walter Nielsen climbing down into that ditch in the rain," I said. "He was an old man who'd lost his boy. He found a kid who was alive, and he made a bad decision. He took care of him. I don't know. I can hold both things." Dennis nodded. "He's always been better than me at letting things go. Dad would have been 60 in 1986, he said. 61, I said. He'd just turned 61. He'd have loved knowing. He would have, I said. And I meant it. Our father was not a man who needed the world to make sense in order to feel grateful for it. He would have driven to Penticton in about 45 minutes of being told. I want to say one more thing, and then I'll let you go. I'm 62 years old. I've had a good life, a good marriage, good kids, a career I didn't hate, a house that's held up. I have no serious complaints. But there have been 38 Novembers where a piece of me was somewhere I couldn't get to, where part of the story was missing, and I learned to live around the gap the way you learn to favor a leg that healed slightly wrong. I didn't know I was still doing that until it stopped. The night of the DNA result, after I called Colin and came inside and Marie held me in the kitchen for a long time without saying anything, I realized I was hungry. Not emotionally, actually physically hungry, which felt bizarre and mundane and somehow exactly right. I made toast. I sat at the kitchen table at 5 in the afternoon and ate toast and looked out the window at the backyard going gray in the November dark. And I thought, the 4th. I'm going to sleep through the 4th this year. I did. If you have someone missing, if you've spent years carrying the weight of not knowing, of a story that ended wrong, or ended too soon, or didn't end at all, I want you to know that the not knowing can change, sometimes slowly. Sometimes through DNA and phone calls and long drives through the Okanagan. Sometimes in ways no one could have predicted. Don't stop looking. Don't let the world convince you that the chapter is closed just because someone put a date on a stone. I'm Robert McPherson. I'm 62 years old, and last November, at 2:20 in the morning, my phone rang. My brother is alive.